All right. I think we'll get started because we don't want to keep you waiting too long to hear Reverend Duncan either. So good evening. My name is Dr. Merritt Trelstad, and I'm a professor in the Religion Department and University Chair of Lutheran Studies here at PLU. And it's my honor to welcome you to the 10th Annual Lutheran Studies Conference at PLU. Each fall we offer this conference, and it connects the gifts of Lutheran higher ed to the pressing issues of our time. And over the years, it's grown into a beautiful space for reflection for hundreds of our students, faculty, staff, congregation, and community members. On our website, you're going to see the past Lutheran Studies conferences and videos of many of the panels and speakers. And this year we have the opportunity to connect virtually to over 800 of you from across the country, I guess representing 26 different states. So to all of you, welcome to PLU. At the start here, I have a few details to keep in mind. Throughout tonight's webinar, you're welcome to offer questions to our speaker through the Q&A function of our Zoom platform, and we'll do our best to summarize themes from the questions offered both prior to the webinar and tonight. I'm offering also a special shout out to my own students this fall in Intro to Christian Theology and the 200 plus people who attended pre-conference book discussions over the last 2 weeks for their thoughtful reading and questions. These were the largest adult forums at a church that I've ever attended. My thanks also go out to Kendall Jeske, Director of Congregational Engagement, and the numerous people at PLU who have worked to bring this event here, and our donor who has funded the chair at PLU. In 2018, the PLU Lutheran Studies Conference theme was based on Kelly Brown Douglas's excellent book, Black Bodies and the Justice of God. And the 2016 conference was titled Free at Last, Lutheran Perspectives on Racial Justice. But the sheer numbers of us here this evening evidence our need to confront, again, the racial violence and white supremacy that continues to grip our nation, resulting in the murder of our Black brothers and sisters in particular. PLU is connected to the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which states, quote, "The ELCA is united in opposing all forms of violence or discrimination and is committed to welcoming all people regardless of sexual orientation and their families into our congregations," unquote. The ELCA has also denounced racism as systemic and pervasive sin for decades. PLU's own diversity statement asserts that diversity is the condition of difference necessary to all life and creativity, and that diversity is intrinsic to the vitality of learning, resilience, and growth. And PLU commits itself to being responsive to how the intersections and context impact how power is experienced, to act upon the fact that diversity and inclusion efforts must address and account for differences born out of power and oppression, and to collectively reimagine models and practices to create inclusive environments where all members of the community can learn, live, work, and most importantly, thrive. I'm hoping that you hear these words, welcome, flourishing, and thriving, present in the ELCA and PLU's statements, which should hopefully serve to welcome us all into this space tonight together. As a university that commits itself to Lutheran higher education, PLU welcomes students to bring their whole self to their work or education. And likewise tonight, we all bring ourselves to this conference webinar. We bring our gender, orientation, racial, cultural, religious, or secular identities. We bring our hearts broken by the pandemic, police brutality, and racial injustice and hatred that's sown deep into our society. As a university, we will not stand down or stand by in the face of white supremacy, violence, and oppression. To that end, we've invited Reverend Lenny Duncan to come speak tonight. As a called and ordained pastor in the ELCA, Reverend Duncan draws from a tradition that knows how to hold something as beloved and valuable while subjecting it to truthful critique and challenge. His 2019 book, Dear Church, a love letter from a Black preacher to the whitest denomination in the US, is a beautiful and challenging letter to his own denomination. A recent Pew study had identified the most and least racially diverse churches in America, and the ELCA received the ranking of the most white, least diverse denomination in the US. Duncan's book addresses the legacy of white supremacy that continues to shape churches, but also he offers a message of love and hope to live into the church's calling in this time. Reverend Duncan is currently serving as a pastor at Messiah Lutheran in Vancouver, Washington, and with the Jubilee Collective in the Portland, Vancouver area. And now, as awkward as it is in our own homes, please join me in applauding and welcoming and giving a warm welcome to Reverend Lenny Duncan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you at PLU. Even though I'm not really here, but I am there. You guys get it. We've all been doing it. I want to start this evening by saying, and I say this every time I'm at an ELCA campus, that I truly believe that in everything that I'm talking about, the front lines for the battle against white supremacy is happening at its best, where I see the most growth, where I see the most opportunity, and where I see the most courageous conversations, and they're happening in two places in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. The first place that they're happening is in our ELCA college system. I'm trying to get to all 25 campuses. I have not been let down once. And it grieves me that my local ELCA college is so close yet so far away in this time of COVID. And I'm so grateful to be with you. The second place that I see a lot of that same sort of life is in our rural churches. So shout out to anyone who's in a rural congregation. Y'all are some real ones, as I like to put it. I want to talk to you a little bit about Dear Church's main premise and the importance of that. I'm going to meander about a few topics, and I know this is going to sound weird to you, but I wrote Dear Church in 2018 in response to some things that I saw happening in 2016. And so it's strange to talk about it in 2020. So I'd like to offer you a gift in exchange. I would like to read from my new book, United States of Grace. I think I've only ever read one small bit of it in one other place. And I want to talk to you about some of the new ideas I'm working with. Then we're going to jump over here to the seat you guys see, and I am going to do some Q&A with y'all. So we'll get into the ideas that I cover in Dear Church, and we'll get into some of the ideas that I love to talk about, but I want to offer you perhaps something different. You know, Dear Church's main premise is simply this. It's that the call of the church in the 21st century is to dismantle white supremacy. That there is no other greater cause. That there is no other focus. There is nowhere else you should be putting your budgets. There is nowhere else, nothing else you should really be preaching on, because if you're preaching about heteronormativity, if you're preaching about patriarchy, if you're preaching about toxic masculinity, if you're preaching about queer phobia, if you're preaching about the evils of capitalism, if you're preaching about immigration, if you're preaching about fascism, perhaps you're concerned about Black Lives Matter, all of that stuff, its root is white supremacy. Every bit of it. The best way to think about it, it's like white supremacy is the grandfather demon, and all of his children, the miseries that he has let loose, are running about this world. And when you take that as a main premise theologically, it gives you a different perspective on the church's role, our republic's role, and perhaps your role in the world. You know, I want to talk a little bit about where I think we are as a country right now, or as a republic. And the first thing I want to tell you is that for 400 years, Black peoples have been the canary in the coal mine for this republic's continued wrestling with the causes of freedom and liberation. We have been and always will be the watermark. I don't know why that is. And I don't know why, well, we could talk about that later. Because there is something to be said about the way um, um, BIPOC peoples are used against each other like tools in white supremacy. And I was going to take a, but for 400 years now, Black peoples have been the canary in the coal mine. And the message I have for you, as someone who's been in Portland this whole time, watching what's happening, serving the people who go down every day. I can only go down like once a week and I'm shattered, right? Of facing state violence, right? In response to the cry, Black Lives Matter. And that's incredibly important for you to think about when we talk about as white supremacy as the root, as the thing that is going to tear down this republic and this church. And so, from what I've seen, I can tell you that it is still true to this day that what they do to Black peoples in the daylight, they will do what they do to us in the daylight, they will do to you in the dark. I want to repeat that in case someone didn't catch it. I want to look into the camera so you know I'm serious, because we're not enfleshed and I can't feel your spirit. But what they do to Black peoples in the daylight, they will do to you in the dark, beloved. And that should be sounding all kinds of alarms for you right now after what I saw in Portland, Oregon. I'm just going to tell you about one night. It was one of my first nights down there. It was about 2 weeks after George Floyd was murdered. And I had just gotten like over the initial PTSD. I mean, the walking, floating PTSD that most Black peoples have nowadays. And I was like, okay, I'm ready to hit the streets. Now I'm like a week and a half, 12 days late, maybe more. And I go out there, and the situation had already escalated to the point that a rabbi I know gave me his tear gas mask to protect my Black body. Because as someone who was out on the streets saying Black Lives Matter, he wanted to put Black bodies before his body. Now, I want you to dig this interfaith witness for a second, because I really think it's important for you to know what's happening on the streets of your country. A rabbi was going to be intentionally gassed with a chemical weapon that's not even used in warfare in other countries and around the world, to give up his tear gas to protect a Black body in America, because that Black body felt compelled, like millions of Black bodies all over this country, to say Black Lives Matter. Now, this is important because it is time for us to have clear eyes about what it is that is happening and what it is we should do. And the third thing is, what are we willing to risk to dismantle white supremacy, or what's at risk when I dismantle white supremacy? And I want to give you the example that we're all thinking of, and I'm just going to say it. I know as a pastor, I'm supposed to remain nonpartisan. I know I'm supposed to rise above it, but let's just talk about the debate for a second. Let's just talk about how the 45th president of the United States absolutely refused to denounce white supremacy. And I don't want to hear all the people who are upset in the comments right now and says, oh, he's done it 100 times. He refused to do it at a critical moment leading up to the election, while he's questioning the peaceful transition of power. If you're not sure how important the peaceful transition of power is, put on Hamilton. It's on Disney Plus. It's one of the main songs, One Last Time. It's what George Washington did that made us different. He ceded his power. Anyway, but when you look at the debate, and he refuses to denounce white supremacy, and then he tells the Proud Boys, which we know in the PLU community and in the Pacific Northwest how dangerous the Proud Boys are, to stand back or stand down and stand ready, or whatever his little dog whistle was, in front of everyone. Beloved, if you don't see right now, if you don't have clear eyes, that during that debate, the former vice president and the current president of the United States openly said they are going to respond with state violence to the cry Black Lives Matter, but that one of them was willing to entice white supremacists to help him, and that the peaceful transition of power is up for grabs for the dream of some weird white ethno-state. That's never going to happen. It's a mirage. And we saw all that play out on the world stage. You know, one of the things I was talking to Merritt about before we started was how disorienting this entire experience has been. You know, when I first started writing Dear Church in 2018, I was a far left guy who was saying that all the world's problems were because of white supremacy, and that all the church's problems were because of it, and that we needed to call on the powers of God and the holy host of heaven in this time to guide the martyrs, disciples, and everyday followers of the way in this critical time in salvation history. I sounded very strange to people. But what we've seen in Portland and in the Republic and the ELCA proves one thing. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is arguably probably the most progressive mainline church in the country. Portland, Oregon is arguably the most progressive city in the country. Do you know what they have in common? Well, I'll tell you. It is the whitest city and the whitest denomination in the country, right? Why is that important? Because just like our leaders, Ted Wheeler here in Portland says all the right things, writes all the right statements. But when the Black people rise up and say Black Lives Matter, his instant response is violence. And the most painful thing, or the most violent thing the church does when we say Black Lives Matter, when we say dismantle white supremacy now, when we say reparations now, is silence, because silence is a weapon of white violence. Reparations, as part of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, first in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and then around this country, much like many of the methods we saw from our comrades in South Africa, might be the only way to heal a nation that is careening towards something. But I want to talk to you tonight mostly about why you have nothing to fear. I know it doesn't sound like that. But what I'm here to tell you is that what we're experiencing is the death throes of white supremacy. What we're experiencing is a cornered animal. What we're experiencing is just the gnashing of teeth of evil. We know its name. We have the power to cast it out. We've been empowered by the saints, by the power of Almighty God in Christ. And by grace, I swear we can do it if we but have clear eyes about it. And so that's my little rant about some of the main premises of Dear Church and how we're seeing it play out in the Republic. And I want to take a moment just to read to you from my new book, United States of Grace, because I think in my new work, I really am focused on switching gears. And I want to take my power analysis wider than the ELCA. I feel like that was too small of a view. So this is from my new book, United States of Grace. How I'm describing United States of Grace is United States of Grace is a defense of the Republic from someone who's never had the rights and the privileges of a citizen. So it's the defense of our republic from the position of an outsider. And the premise is setting aside our leaders, setting aside our systems, and even for a second, setting aside our history of oppression. What this republic is moments like this. It's you and me and hundreds of other people gathered to try to turn the tide, who believe in freedom, who are ready to rise up, who are willing to hold America to account for its promises, who are true believers in the church and not careerists. I would rather lose my job in this church than ever deny Jesus Christ or his call to me. And so I want to read you from the preface, and then we'll switch over to Q&A, and that way it'll feel a little bit less like me ranting at the screen. Y'all, pray for your black preachers. It's been so hard to preach at a screen and not hear anything back. Whenever I tell my story, how I grew up in West Philadelphia, left home at the age of 13, lived on the streets doing sex work and dealing drugs, got my GED in prison, and somehow wound up a preacher, I describe my life as a trajectory of grace. In fact, I think grace runs through the ley lines and county borders that litter the landscape of this country, churning through the small towns and major cities. Our lives are a blind date with mercy, but we have to pay attention to see this grace revealed. The search for grace seems like a contradiction, to be very honest with you. How do you find a thing of force, a powerful river of love whose current sweeps us away, usually from behind? But grace can be found. We can wrap our arms around it and ride it to destinations unclear, unknown, and lovely. And that's what this book is about, tracking this path of grace, stalking it down the highways that are crisscrossing this country like veins pumping lifeblood of this nation throughout its wholly broken and often misunderstood body. An old Buddhist proverb describes a group of blind men that come upon an elephant for the first time, and they hear that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought to town, but none of them were aware of its shape or form, and out of curiosity they said, "We must inspect it, know it by touch, of which we are capable." And so they sought it out. And when they found it, they groped about it. And the first person whose hand landed on the trunk said, "This being is like a thick snake." And to another whose hand reached its ear, it seemed like a kind of a fan. And another whose hand touched its leg said, "The elephant's like a pillar or a tree trunk." And the blind man who placed his hand upon its side said, "The elephant is a wall." And another one who felt its tail described it as a rope. The last felt its tusk, stating that the elephant is that which is hard and smooth. It is like a spear. Trying to capture the full beauty and majesty of the United States of America is like this proverb. How do I hold in tension the beauty of the Rockies stolen from indigenous people with the rising dawn over the Front Range from Boulder, Colorado? How do I walk through the green rolling fields of North Carolina and not think about my great, 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 great grandfather and how he bled in those same fields and how the sweat of his brow is the very foundation of that state? How do I stand in New York City and walk the busy sidewalks in Manhattan, swept in the awe and the great things we are capable of, and ignore the NYCHA housing that is crammed next to the monuments of end-stage capitalism? And that's the problem when we talk about America. We are grabbing the trunk and saying it feels like systemic racism, or grabbing the tail and saying it feels like it's safe and it might be home, or rubbing the ear and saying it feels like it's just and smooth. And none of us, including our leaders, has a full picture. I'm certainly not claiming to have a full picture. But I've seen this country's highways and byways up close and personal. I've seen more of it than almost everyone I know. I'm going to tell you a secret that most people who know me or have read my previous work or had ever seen anything I'd ever said would never guess. I'm absolutely in love with this country. I mean, in a passionate, up all night, texting love affair, kissing when no one is looking because it feels so great new love affair, like a sweaty, palmy hand holding down the streets of Brooklyn kind of love. I mean, singing love songs while cracking open the fire hydrant for the kids down the street kind of love. And this is the Book of Contradictions. I'll be telling you about a world that's done nothing but reject, try to kill, or push aside everything that I am. I will be telling you about the hope that I've gathered I found in gatherings of communities across a large swath of the North American continent. Places and communities that have given us evidence, both historically and more pointedly lately, that we shouldn't have any hope in them, that we are irredeemable, permanently shattered. This country is unsalvageable. And perhaps this is true. It certainly feels that way as I scan the morning news or see anything coming out of Washington, D.C. I get the sense that this is what it feels like when great empires fall on their face. The pain and tragedy and utter senselessness of it all is too much for any of us to bear on most days. And this book won't deny any of that. In fact, the plan is to embrace all your tears and scars and the very rightful reason to take this American dream to task. But I want to suggest that the power of this place, its people and not its institutions. In fact, when I talk about America, I do so with the underlying assumption that its institutions are evil and corrupt, full stop. But the dreamers, those of us still engaged in building and often rebuilding the promises and visions of this country, those of us who are wrestling with the angels and will likely walk away like Jacob, limping but blessed, well, damn it, we are America. We are the America that I'm writing about, that I'm in love with, that I want to tap on the shoulder and remind that I'm still here, that you are still here, and that can never be stolen from you. Let me tell you something. That same great grandfather I told you about, well, his son fought with the Union Army for this thing that was always denied, freedom. That veteran had a son after he moved back to North Carolina, and his family grew to span the length of the entire East Coast. 13 children of a Union Army vet, brothers and sisters, one of whom settled in West Philadelphia and happened to be my grandfather. He went to fight fascism and the Axis, but returned to a country that denied him the benefits of dignity of being treated like a man. Yet he carved out a life for all of us on 63rd and Race in West Philadelphia. It's the same block where I watched someone open up a fire hydrant on a summer day, break the 90-degree heat, creating my first black hero at 4 years old. The older kid who dressed up so damn cool and had the key to open up the water plug, as I called it, and created joy in what some would characterize as a joyless place. 3 feet of wet, hot concrete joy and barefoot jubilation. That's the spot I'm trying to hit in this book. What I'm aiming for, and what I'll most likely miss. I'm going to tell you about my life in the country I love through a series of tragedies and stories that are deeply personal, filled with pain and struggle, and might actually horrify some of you. It will be a vast array of trauma and things no one should have to go through. It is in these really broken places that I will try to tell you about love and grace. I'm afraid. I'm afraid you will misunderstand me or think I'm trying to paint a rosy picture about the stark industrial wasteland landscape that is this country. I'm afraid that when I give you almost all of me that I can stand, you will weigh me and find me wanting of the things that you have come here for. That you will see me plant glorious, vibrant, living things next to death and white supremacy in the same paragraph, the same sentence even, and think that I don't see the paradox or the utter ridiculousness that is my hope for you, for us, for myself, for this country. For these things that many would have you believe we don't deserve to hope for anymore. I am afraid that if you're a white, you will walk away saying that isn't the America I know. And if you're a black, you will say this damn fool still believes their lives. I am afraid that if you are POC, you will feel left out of my narrative. I am afraid that if you are queer in this country, you may wonder why am I comparing our incredibly glorious ways of loving each other in the world to their heteronormative paradigms that seem to bring only misery. If you are a queer reader of this book, I wonder why I keep setting the bar at a heteronormative society that's deemed love, that has deemed as love, even though we know it is a whitewashed tomb bereft of the hope of resurrection. I am afraid, and I am damn tired of being afraid, and I'm willing to bet you are too. I'm willing to gamble on the fact that you're tired of hiding in the shadows and the ambiguity of grace, that you're tired of being wedged between mercy and despair, and we're all sick of the actual magnificence of this country being obscured by monstrous leaders who are jerking off to fever dreams about nationalism. We are all over the tired narratives that nothing is woke enough, which leads to the oppression Olympics where no discernible change actually takes place because we're too busy policing one another while riot police tear gas our neighbors. I'm tired of the narrative that there's nothing of worth in this place I live and love and breathe in. I'm tired of being afraid to say that grace is real and it's real for this country. I'm tired of feeling like my belief will be dashed against the rocks of inequity moments after it dares to be reborn. And we know what this fear is. It's the mounting evil that's slowly but surely marching from the beaches of Atlantic City to 5 Points in Atlanta, that's interjecting itself in conversation in Des Moines and rising like the floodwaters in Houston. We already know what this evil is, and we know it isn't the people. Our fate isn't different than others who were brought here as cargo. We are the story of our indigenous siblings whose homes are destroyed by our very presence. We are the scared 18-year-old kid who isn't so much storming the beaches of Normandy as being thrown up against a boat, thrown out of a boat into a greater battle beyond his capacity to truly grasp. We are a scared little girl walking into a school surrounded by National Guard troops for the crime of wanting to learn. And God damn it, we are amazing. And even when the story of this country isn't, we still are. And I would suggest that it is the responsibility of every generation to carry on this never-ending battle for freedom. But more importantly, it's our job to capture the story of each of us and treat those stories as sacred. Here and now, we get to write the scripture of the future. It may not get into the canon, but we can't deny the stories have a way of speaking to us in the deeper, hidden inner recesses of our souls. My story can only be my own, but by placing myself in the grand mural that God is painting on this country and not attempting to hide its more violent hues, I hope to create space for you to find yourself in my story, to track the distance between us so that whether your own story sits right up against mine or there is a gulf of difference, somehow knowing where I stand, my location, makes us both feel less alone. Real connection through pages spread out over the distance of months and years to publication. A note in a bottle sent over rivers of love and grace that hopefully wash up on your shores. A direct map to my heart, or as most deaf put it, from wherever I am to wherever you are. We're all dying for real connection and authenticity. So for me, this is my attempt to be as naked as possible in a room full of strangers. And I propose to you that grace is the only export and commodity that this country has left that isn't tainted by the history of systemic oppression that has gripped this nation by its throat. That the gullible hope they sell you in elementary school isn't something to be completely ignored or cast off. That somewhere between the propaganda and the foolish dreams is the flesh and bones of a country we know and love. And we will follow the trajectory of grace as it bounces around our bodies, like the bullet coming out of a 22 in the neighborhood I grew up in, hitting someone I love. I'm going to switch to the Q&A now.
I think that's partly my cue there. We have Reverend Duncan. Oh, there you are. I have questions that people have submitted, and I'm just going to read some of them out loud.
Yeah.
All right. So, and this one's a little long because it combines a couple questions. It's, I noticed in chapter 1, so this is in church, you make many comparisons or parallels to the life of Jesus and the life of Black and Indigenous people of color today. The quotes are from the book. We carry our lynching tree up the hill like the Savior before us. If we do this work in our congregations, we find that Jesus has been among us all along. Resurrection is possible, but it will take all of us rising up. And we may be broken in the process. We may have to look America in the eye and say, this is my body broken for you. There were a couple questions out of there. One person wrote, Not many people compare themselves to the Son of God. In another context, you could read as arrogant or
Oh,
glorified,
yeah.
but they say your parallel is far more intentional. So what do you hope the reader gains from the
Yeah.
exact
Yeah,
narrative
no,
today to Jesus?
yeah, no, that's great. I mean, so here's the thing, right? That's not my work. We know that's James Cone's work. We know that comes from the cross and the lynching tree. We know that comes from God of the oppressed. To that student, I would say, to position where I'm coming from, you have to make several leaps. So there's some foundational stuff around James Cone's work you have to get into. I would suggest God of the oppressed. The new thing that white liberals love to tell you is read Cross and the Lynching Tree. But if you don't understand God of the oppressed, you're not going to make it through. You're going to see it and you're going to be like, wow, that really shook me. But you're not going to understand the full premise of what Dr. Cone was trying to say. And it's his last work. So I think it's important to do that, right? And the second thing is that then the idea was really fleshed out by womenist theologians, because at the end of Black theology, at the very end, is some of the same reprehensible behaviors from Black cis men, particularly around patriarchy. So what happens when you are under a system of oppression is you start to learn the behaviors of the oppressor and act those out in yourself and in your own life, and usually against your own people. This is why sometimes when I know young women often talk about how the previous generation for them in ministry are so hard on them, harder than sometimes men are, like, you know what I mean, like in weird ways, because and anyway, it's internalized depression. Google it. So Kelly Brown Douglas, who I am honored to be the person following up, one of my heroes, that book set me off in seminary on a trail. And in fact, that's where I get the line where I talk about how, why don't you ever assign Black theologians as the main reading, right, in any of your classes, which I heard you did, Dr. And so I really appreciate that. And that's because that was an extra book assigned to me in seminary. It was one of 40 extra books. And I read the title and I said, why isn't this the center of what we're talking about? So anyway, I would read that book after reading after reading God of the Oppressed, after reading Cross and Lynching Tree, to make sure, particularly if you're in a male body, to make sure you don't act like a creep like I show up half the time, right? Because guys just show up with that stuff. It's so hard to undress masculinity and show up with an open heart, right? But then you should read the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas's work, right? And go back to the PLU Lutheran Studies Conference from 2016 and look at those materials, right? And then you land where Dear Church is situated. And where Dear Church is situated is in a long tradition of Black theologians using the incarnation of Christ to explain the situation of Black peoples in this country. And so I'm just going to explain how I see the story of Jesus, and you tell me who that describes and tell me if I'm historically, culturally, or sociologically incorrect. We can discuss if I'm theologically incorrect. I think that's always open for debate. That's what makes us Lutheran, right? But I worship a God who lived in a country where he was under oppression from Proto-Europeans who were not from there. They came from Italy. That's where Rome was. I'm sorry to point it out to you on a map, right? So Proto-Europeans, the early structures of what we see later on, the German Empire based itself off of, the Prussian Empire based itself off of. So it's not like Rome faded away and then these ideas just disappeared upon the European scene. It's silly to pretend that happened. So it's also the only place where white people show up in the whole Bible. Hate to break it to you. That's it. That's where you show up. I'm sorry. That's it. That's the only place you're in the Bible. You show up as the police and murderers. That's historically, genetically, sociologically, culturally correct. I'm sorry. I don't mean to report your own history to you. Right? It's frightening how many people will be offended that I just said that. Right? But all I'm doing is reporting your own history to you. And so, okay, so that's who you are. That's where you show up. That's culturally, that's where you land. Now, who's Jesus? Jesus lives in the land of Palestine. He's under intense Roman occupation. They are constantly policed. That's who the centurions are. They are police. It looks more like Bethlehem and not like the city of Jerusalem, right? So it looks like Palestinian oppression. There are people being stopped everywhere. Why is Jesus born in the town of Bethlehem? Because the Roman emperor wants to do a census, so he orders everyone in the world to go back to their place of birth, and the entire world complies. Okay. So you have a poor, itinerant, homeless, ethnic person under oppression in his own land from an oppressive empire, and then through a conspiracy of his own people, right? His own, I'm not talking ethnically, I mean religiously, from a conspiracy of religious leaders and the state combined is how we murdered the savior of the world. And how is he killed? He is arrested in the middle of the night with no trial in front of his friends. There is great violence. He is beaten, lynched, tried with no one to defend him, right? And then hung from a tree. Who in this country does that describe? If that describes your history and your people, then I retract everything I said. And there are other peoples in this country who are facing crucifixion. Our indigenous siblings, uh, the sojourner or the so-called immigrant in this country. I mean, what we saw just in Salem, they used the same tactics that they used in Portland. Those same federal agents, after they got pushed out of Portland, which wasn't true, went down to Salem to do an immigration, grab, a snatch and grab. They do a snatch and grab in unmarked vehicles with unmarked military gear and masks on. No badges, no identifying gear. No one knows who they are. They run up in the middle of the town. They snatch someone from the streets. Same things we saw happening in Portland. And this is an important point to make, that progressive cities and progressive institutions and progressive denominations are ripe for fascism to happen. That's why I draw the parallel between Portland and the ELCA. It's right because we think we're saying all the right things and we think we're doing all the right things, and we take our eye off the ball of what's really happening to real people on the ground. So they take those tactics they used against black people, right? And then they move them down to Salem. They do a snatch and grab in an unmarked rental car with no badge, no nothing. Of course, the community tries to stop them, because if I saw my neighbor screaming and crying because someone was stuffing them inside a van, I'm going to run over and say, what's happening right now, right? And the whole community comes out and does that. They stop the van, and what do? The same thing we saw in Portland. They tear gas people. They shoot them with rubber bullets. They're shooting mothers in the streets. They're shooting grandmothers. These aren't hardened protesters. These are people who are trying to stop their friends from being kidnapped, they think. All of that stuff is to say that there are certain people in this land who are being crucified. And if it was your people being crucified, I would stand up for them. It's not a badge of honor. No one is comparing themselves to the Almighty God. What we're saying is, we are not the Almighty God. We are your siblings in Christ, but yet we are being murdered the same way the people of God murdered love, in almost the exact same methods. We are saying, just feel our pain. And if you can't feel our pain, then remember Christ's pain in those moments and see if that brings you closer. And if that doesn't bring you closer, then I don't got nothing for you, man. I'm not here to convince people of my personhood anymore. So I think that's my sort of answer to that question. What's the next one?
Great. Thank you. Number two, what are the key things you're looking at in order to make the determination that a church is, and it's a quote from the book, deemed safer for persons of color or unsafe? So what are some key things you're looking for? And another person I'd use the word criteria.
Yeah, I mean, I listen. We know that there's never going to be a safe place for the foreseeable future for any BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, or person of color. If that's the first time you've heard that term, so if I use it for the rest of the talk, you know what I'm saying. Um, there's never a safe place for BIPOC people in this country. That's not the history that we have, right? I mean, you're talking to someone who was brought here as cargo generations ago, and for at least 6 or 7 generations, as long as this has been a republic, if not longer, my people have, we've been dealing with the generational effects of us being stolen, right? And that so in that sense, there's never a safe place in that structure for BIPOC people. What I always talk about is, what does it mean if you have a courageous space or a liberating space, right? A liberating space is knowing that you're going to, oh, I want to get this out the way. I have a Richard Pryor quote for you. Someone asked Richard Pryor why he cussed so much. He said, Richard, why do you curse so much? He said, because black people are cursed people. So I'm sorry, I'm going to fucking cuss. But anyway, I, my point is that there's never going to be a safe space, but there's liberating spaces. You got to be willing to fall on your face in front of everyone as a white person. That's the first criteria. You need to see that white people are willing to fall on their face, make an ass of themselves, and realize a couple things. And here's the first thing. The pain you feel of saying the wrong thing in front of BIPOC people is not worse than the pain they feel every day living in this country. Get over yourself. The second thing is, when you fall on your face, how I know if you're a real one, how I know you're committed to this work, how I know you're committed to the community, how I know you actually care, is after you fuck up, because that's what it is. I'm not going to use pretty words for it, right? That's how you feel when you do it, right? I don't know why we're so worried about my language, but we're not worried about cops who literally put their knees on people's necks for 8 minutes and murder them in their country. But I'll get 5 emails because I dropped the F-bomb tonight. But not one email about, hey, how you doing since like George Floyd died? It's interesting what the church's obsessions are. But anyway, when you fuck up like that, you stay in it. You don't leave. See, that's how I know. When you fall on your face and you are utterly embarrassed, and you're embarrassed not because you're stupid or doing something wrong. You don't know what you don't know. Right? And everyone gets to start where they get to start, right? And so if I'm inviting you onto that journey and you get to start where you get to start, and then I stop you and say, beloved, what you did was harmful. It was wrong. You've centered yourself, and you really need to figure out how you're going to repair what you did here with the rest of the community. And here are the restorative ways we can bring you back into that community, right? If I offer you all that, and then you say, well, I don't want any parts, that's too much. Or you say, I don't like the way Lenny said that. I don't like his tactics. Right? And you decide to opt out, well, then you didn't ever care about racial justice. Here's an interesting stat. 32% of the people supported Martin Luther King at the height of his ministry. 32% in 1964. At the height of Black Lives Matter, the highest it's floated around is 32% or 36%. If you're watching this right now and you like to think in the 60s you'd be marching with Martin, if you've ever wondered what you were going to do in the civil rights era, you're doing it right now. Don't make yourself some hero you're not. That's the first thing. You need to take a real look about where you are, where this country is, and where your priorities are. And if you're a person of faith, you need to be asking your church, where are your priorities right now? If your priorities are about institutional malaise, propping up things for the future, making sure that you just trot along, then you're not doing the work of God right now at a critical time in the history of the Republic. And I claim in salvation history itself. And so we need to hold all our leaders to account for this from top to bottom, because we all sense this. We're not walking out of our homes to the same world. And we get to decide what that new world looks like. And we get to decide, I'm sorry, I hate to say, we get to decide if you're our president of our universities, of our seminaries, of our country. We get to decide if you're our bishop. We get to decide if we go to your church. The people are going to get to decide, and the people are watching. The people are watching, and so I think it's a time to hold our leaders to account on all these things, and to be incredibly soberly honest with the folks that we serve as leaders, whether you're an educational leader, a community leader, whether you're just a leader in your home, right? We need to look at things with sober eyes right now and not pretend that everything's going to be okay. We've been pretending for 4 years nothing's going to be okay, guys. Just let that go, and we can decide what the new world will look like if we but grasp it. Anyway, that was a long rant. Next question.
It's good. 2 questions on passivity and racism, and one I'm going to read it out loud and the other I'll try to summarize. On page 16, you talk about systematic racism and how being passive as a white person adds fuel to the system. How can I, a person of color, better educate my friends to be less passive? There was another question from a different perspective. On page 20, you talk about the discussion of reparation regarding the ways that the church has benefited from slavery. I come from a very conservative state where right now many people are making an argument that politics and church must stay separate and refuse to acknowledge any sort of responsibility for action. What kind of argument would you make to try to help people understand that being passive and excusing the church from any sort of action is harmful and it requires action to end systemic racism?
Well, we're running low on time, and I want to get to the reparations thing, right? Because let's not pretend that people haven't been reading this blog I've been putting out about reparations, that I very publicly got my hands dirty and took some cheap shots at our presiding bishop and our church. I mean, let's have a moment, team. I want to say one hard thing to you, but first I want to say the loving thing to you. The loving thing I want to say to you about my public call for reparations, which I made a movie about, I wrote a whole book about, and I've talked about in every region of the ELCA consistently for 3 years. I don't know why everyone's so shocked by this, but let's talk about it. For someone who has so many critiques about the church, I sure as hell love it. I sure as heck have bet my whole life on it. Moved my family thousands of miles a couple of times. Built my whole education around it. Stamped this tradition on my hand for everyone to see. Have structured my life, my love, my joy, even my literature around it. But I'm still here. And here's the hard thing. White people don't get to decide what tactics, what methodology, or what way I get to fight for my freedom. You don't get to decide in 1 minute that I'm the loving, really nice, light-skinned, easy-to-accept Negro that you read in Dear Church, and then the next minute, see me actually live out those same ideas I explained to you, and then treat me as if you have any part of that conversation. When my back is up against the wall and I'm fighting for my freedom. So did I get my hands dirty? Tell some stories out of school? Get kind of mean? Yes. But let me put that in perspective for you. For 100 days, I went into the ELCA clergy room and every day posted about my friends being shot with rubber bullets, begging people for money for tear gas, mass, begging people for money for bail funds, begging people to pay attention. And yes, I was very mean to our presiding bishop. Our presiding bishop only follows 1% of her followers. I'm one of them. She saw every one of my tweets. She saw me arguing with the mayor of Portland. She saw me being threatened by white supremacists. And she saw me begging the country to pay attention. And yes, I did all of that in the last 5 weeks to prove a point. I was mean, and I'm not proud of some of the things I said. But that's the thing, is that organizing sometimes is going to get dirty, and it's going to get mean, and Black people are not going to respond or act in the ways that you want them to. Because let me tell you something. I'm 100% convinced that if white America does not do something quickly in the next 5 years, the struggle for Black liberation will start to look like the characteristics of the Palestinian struggle for freedom. And I think what we saw in Compton and then in Texas 2 years ago and other incidents are just the beginning of the anger and rage that for generations our people have kept at bay. We have preached over our young ones. We have taught our young ones. We have sent them to your colleges. We have sent them to your military. We've even sent them to your police forces. We've done everything we could to conform. You killed our prophets. You murdered them. You murdered our best and our brightest. You murdered all our thinkers. And now you ask us why we can't think. You arrest all our fathers, and then you say it's because we don't have families at home. And so, yes, in the cause for reparations, at this one point, I decided that my little bit of a platform was worth more than selling a few books for 1517 media. Yes, I did. And I have the right to do that, and I don't owe an explanation to anyone. That's my freedom. You don't get to choose what I do with my platform or who I am. I want to get that out the way because I want to talk about reparations with clear eyes. I want to admit what I did because it was the only way I could get you to pay attention. I was mean to your presiding bishop, and now you don't like me. And that's okay. I'm okay with that because now you're looking. And to prove my point, I asked for $32,000 seed money to start a endowment fund for reparations in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, with the first stated goal of helping to supplement the retirement funds of our elder African descent ministers in this church, who, due to redlining, end stage capitalism, lack of investment by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and all the other economic conditions we know that oppress Black communities, guess who's been serving in those churches? Guess who hasn't been making full pay their whole lives? Guess who may not have health care in 3-4 years? Guess who may have to go on like food stamps after serving this church for 30, 40, 50 years? And that's a sin, and that's a grievous sin. And for this church to pretend that it isn't, and not to have a plan, to never discuss it. Anyway, that's all I did. I started a GoFundMe, and I'm opening an endowment, hiring a lawyer to draw up the nonprofit paperwork, and then turning that over to a group of Black women leaders, right? And then I'm letting congregations, individuals, and synods make the choice. That 10%, not all of it, but of all your mission support, but the 10% that usually goes to churchwide. So 10% of 10%, 1%, right? That 1% that goes to churchwide, you get to ask yourself, do you feel like they're using that money towards the most critical thing that's happening in America? Dismantling white supremacy and facing the rise of white supremacy in this country. I'm not, the FBI director agrees with me. I'm not making this stuff up. And so if our church won't pay attention to it, right, and start these conversations, how will the rest of the country do it? So we lead the way. We be Christ in the world. We be the hands and feet of God, right? Isn't it supposed to be God's work in our hands, right? So we show them that we can do reparations amongst ourselves. So maybe those conversations around diverting budgets and investing in Black community happen on a national level, right? And then maybe we can start to turn this thing we see in America. But instead, What we continue to do as Lutherans is because we are so in love with our intellectual prowess that we spend all of our time theologizing, writing statements, having book clubs, just doing 100 things, but what Jesus actually told us to do. And Jesus told us to lose our lives. Even in the face of death, Jesus told us to show up for neighbor no matter what. Jesus told us to be embodied with them. Jesus told us so many things that the church refuses to move on. And so, yes, I held our national leaders to account on the question of reparations because it involves all of these larger issues I'm talking about. And why? And here's the real question you need to ask yourself. Why are you questioning a 42-year-old queer black man who got his GED in high school and then crammed an entire master's in 4 years, wrote a book on his own, and is launching a church for you about how he's handling this conversation? Why don't you flip that and ask those in systems of power with a much bigger presence, with much more power and much more assets and much more access and much more of everything to make this conversation move forward in the way that I think you deserve, lovingly, not with some guy raging outside the gates, right? Why won't they give you that loving conversation you're hungry for? If I'm doing it wrong, why won't they provide it? And here's the truth. The truth is that the church would rather hold on to the third of us who don't care about white supremacy and continue to get that money in their coffers than they would to face it. And that's just the truth. They're afraid a third of our church will walk away if we became a real anti-racist church. And they'd rather hold on to the institution than actually change the world. And you don't have to believe me, just watch them. Just watch them. And so that's why reparations are important. If we don't invest in black communities, there will always be crime. There will always be over-policing. There will always be the same designed financial disaster of end-stage capitalism. And there will always be the ugly fear of white supremacy. And it doesn't matter if it's an obvious fool like the current president. It will get smoother. It will get slicker. It will be on any party, and it will be the same exact agenda. We have to invest in the people. We have to invest in this country because our leaders don't want to, politically, socially, and theologically. They are not interested in that. They are more interested in holding on to what little bit they have. And that's it. They're not willing to take a risk. I would rather risk the entire denomination. I would rather risk every congregation. I would rather risk everything and every asset this church has to heal this nation. And if we were wrong, we were wrong. It didn't work, but we tried. Instead, what we will get is gradual statements, little theological treaties, sad tweets that are full of both sidism, and no action over and over again. And the few black leaders who are internally in that system and the other people in that system who are trying to change things, they're going to get grinded up. And I'll say this one last thing. The great truth is that oppressive organizations are chock full of incredibly good people. I've had dinner with Elizabeth Eden. Don't tell me I know she's a good person. I know, I have been comforted by her presence. I know who she is, but that doesn't change the aggregate effect of the organization. And who do you hold to account to that? I know as a pastor, when something's going wrong at the congregation, they come to me. They don't go to the janitor. They don't write a nice note. Well, sometimes, they're not so nice notes, but sometimes they write notes. So my point is that I'm not talking about the people there. I believe that if I was elected presiding bishop tomorrow, within 3 years, I would be the exact same person. It's our systems. They compromise us, they break us down, and we can't see the forest for the trees anymore. And so that's my beef with the church I love. I'm just begging it to be the church. I'm begging it to be the church in the same way that George begged for breath. And so, sorry for that rant. I know we ran over our time. Is there anything else that you want to cover before I go? I'm feeling a little loose and willing to talk.
Yeah, it's now you wrote quite a bit about reparations and economics, and those are throughout Dear Church too. It's woven on every page. Interestingly, not a lot of questions on that were submitted. So I'm glad you spoke to it. I think that's the thing that kind of resonates and shakes on a day-to-day basis. Through it. There's one. I think this must be from a student, but I guess I will. Throw this out. If you were to give, maybe we could end on this one. If you were to give young Lutherans, church people, students, anyone here, one step to take toward dismantling white supremacy, what would it be?
You need to learn to wage peace. When you are someone who wages peace, you are always in two cycles. One cycle is building peace, which is the cycle I'm going to enter in January. I'm obviously tired. I've obviously been exposed to too much state violence. I'm obviously not doing well, but I'm willing to bet tons of you are not doing well in your homes, and tons of you are experiencing a lot of trauma, and a ton of you are like digging more into therapy, and like some of you have domestic violence at home, and some of you have drug and alcohol stuff going on at home. Like none of us are doing well, right? And so so that's building peace, self-care, self-knowledge. If you're a BIPOC person, knowledge of self, learn your true history, learn the places that we hid our culture in the church. Remember that Master wanted Christians, so Master got Christians. And so we have a strong scriptural and biblical witness that doesn't look anything like the white church in a lot of ways. And to lean into that, and so you're either building peace or you're waging peace. And you need to figure out where your congregation, your institution, your school, your group, your clique, where are they at? Are they in the building peace or the waging peace stage? Waging peace. So when George Floyd died, and if your institution or your group of friends or you or your congregation was caught flat-footed and you didn't know what to do, you're in the building peace stage. That is the time for the book club. That is the time to go to torydouglas.com and download White Homework. It's a 12 lesson thing that's about your community, wherever you are embedded throughout the country. It makes you investigate the history of white supremacy in your own community. That's Tory Douglas, and that's toryglass.com, toryglass.com, and it's White Homework. You need to read the books, right? Read Ibram and find out the holes in his like theory, right? Because there's holes in Dear Church. There's major holes in Dear Church, right? That are I'm always surprised no one ever asked me about, like gaping ones. But anyway, like look at Ibram X's stuff. Look at a white fragility, right? All that stuff has problems. All of it has holes in their analysis of America and analysis of where we are. But you need to build peace. You need to figure out what's going on in your own community. You need to do that stuff with like White Homework or whatever embeds you in what's happening in your town by your congregation. And then you need to be ready because they're going to kill another black person. And it's going to happen real soon. And it's going to be heinous. The revolution is brought to you by Cricket and Metro PCS. The only reason white people are standing up now is because the proliferation of cheap, affordable cell phones, which led to the proliferation of easy to send social media clips of us being murdered. Did you think it started with Trayvon? This has been my everyday reality since I was a child. It was my father's reality. It was his father's reality and his father's reality. And if you don't understand the roots of policing and how every sheriff system was built just to catch runaway slaves and then later on to keep the workers on the camps, and that's the only reason we even have prisons, then you really don't know shit about your own country, and I weep for you. And so when they murder another one of us, because they're going to, and you've done all the building of peace, then it's time to wage peace. And that means you should have identified 4 or 5 people who are willing to go out in the streets with you as a pastor, as a teacher, as a leader, or as a student, and go out and say Black Lives Matter. You've already talked about the safety. You've already talked about if there's violence. You already have a plan if there's direct action. You're already figuring out how your community can support them. Are you just going to be a place where protesters can use the bathroom, clean tear gas out their eyes, be safe, and actually get something to eat? Or are you actually going to go out into the streets and actually say something this time? And if you're not going to do that, who is the first senator that your quilting circle is going to call that morning? And how do you activate those networks immediately? It always amazes me when I talk to rostered leaders in the evangelical Lutheran Church in America who've been at church for 20 years and tell me they don't now talk about racism. You're going to tell me that somehow I build more rapport with people in a few minutes than you do in a couple decades? Get it together. Talk about it. Build the peace, so when it's time to go out and wage peace, when it's time for you to step in between the police and protesters, when it's time for you to maybe take a bullet for those you love, when it's time for you to maybe choke on some gas, when it's time for you to bear witness, which I think is the purest sense of the Christian deal, or followers of the way. The purest sense of that is to bear witness. I don't go to protests. I don't do anything but stand there in collar and bear witness and be the eyes of Christ. Sometimes I say the names of the dead, and sometimes I say Black Lives Matter. But I'm not out there organizing. I'm standing there and being the hands and feet of Christ, being the embodied promise that Christ would always be with us at times like this. And so sometimes I'm just out there so a few dozen people can thank me for being there. And you know what the saddest part of all that is every time I'm out there in collar, even though I'm Black, they're still surprised I'm out there. Everyone's still shocked I'm out there, and they thank me over and over again. And they always say, I stopped going to the church, I stopped believing in the church, I can't stand the church, but man, does it give me hope that even y'all are out here. That's who we could be if we but grasped it. Not just some kid with a backpack, a Twitter account, and a van that he's spray painted on the side. He's calling it a church. I think I'm done. I want to thank you for this time. Seriously.
Thank you for being with us. And I think we'll all go into the night with lots to think about. And I really, really appreciate you being with us here.
Well, I can't wait for y'all to have me when we can all meet in flesh and in person. So I can tell if there were people actually cheering for me on the other end, or if there were people like, what is this dude talking about? I gotta tell you, it's such a weird world. I miss the people of God. And I love the people of God so fiercely. And I'm willing to lose everything. I'm willing to lose everything to stand up for them.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Rest well. Pastor Duncan, thank you for staying longer with us. Good night, everybody. Thank you.